And now joining us on Book TV from Stanford University is Professor Debra Satz. She's a professor of ethics in society and a professor of philosophy here at Stanford. And she's written this book, Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale, The Moral Limits of Markets. Professor Satz, why is a philosophy professor writing about economics?
Oh, good question. Well, economics involves lots of different dimensions. I think it was Gladstone who once said, budgets aren't just matters of arithmetic, they're matters of our values. And economics inevitably raises questions of ethics. Some of the most obvious questions of ethics concern the legitimacy or justice of distribution that the market produces. But there are other kinds of questions too. So there are questions, for example, about should you be able to sell your kidney like you sell an apple? Why, what should we think about markets in toxic waste, or child labor markets, or markets in access to information? How should we think about those markets? Are they different in kind? Are sex markets different in kind than automobile markets? And so those raise questions of ethics. You can't think about modern markets and their role in social life without thinking about the myriad goods and some bads that markets produce.
Let's take two of those things that you write about. And number one, you write about prostitution. Mm-hmm. And should that be for sale? Just to answer your question.
Mm-hmm. So I don't have a easy way of answering this. I actually think the questions are more complicated than people have thought. And so what I try to do in my book is take some intuitive reactions people have to different kinds of markets. So most people react differently, even if they think prostitution should be legal. They think there's something different about selling sex than selling apples or cars. They think there's something different about selling organs. They may think there's something different about selling healthcare. And so what I try to do is see whether there are features of the markets that concern us, not about what we should do about them, but if there's a way of understanding why we react differently to these markets than other markets. And so I develop in my book a theory about that. It's a bit of a complex theory. There are 4 different dimensions that I argue give rise to concern. And not all markets that are worrying in the same way. It's like what Tolstoy said about happy families. All happy families are the same, but unhappy families are all unhappy in their own way. So they're problematic markets and they differ, but they have these 4 dimensions that are similar. So think about prostitution. A couple of things about prostitution that are important. One is that in the way prostitution exists in our society, it's often, especially if you think about street prostitution, people are pretty desperate. And often people who are desperate and under the control of other people, like pimps, often a very high percentage of streetwalkers are addicts. So there are a lot of features that the normal market, the apple market, doesn't have. Most people buying and selling apples aren't addicted. They're not under the thumb of somebody who's controlling them. They have the ability to say no and walk away from the trade. That isn't the case in many instances of prostitution. And so one thing I look at is, could we regulate prostitution to get rid of some of the concerns? And would there be other concerns that would still remain even in a society which got rid of the desperation that drives a lot of people to prostitution?
Well, those 4 parameters that you have in here, very quickly, I just want to read those. They're vulnerability, weak agency, extremely harmful outcomes for individuals, and extremely harmful outcomes for society. Where does prostitution fall in those 4 parameters?
So the vulnerability of the prostitute would be one of the most important aspects of prostitution. There's some weak agency. So again, prostitution takes many forms, but some prostitutes are very young, and some of them are under the control of other people who are making the decisions about what they do, who they sleep with, how, what conditions. So they're not transacting in the market on their own behalf. So that's some forms, not all forms of prostitution are like this. And then there is systematic inequalities between men and women in society and the way they're viewed. And prostitution may play a role in reinforcing certain kinds of images that people have about women. So the instance of rape and violence against prostitutes is many, many times higher than the instance of rape and violence against women who are not prostitutes. And so one question is, why is that? And that is partly because we're dealing with an illegal activity. Some of that might go away if it were legal, but some of it is we're dealing with very, very vulnerable people in very bad circumstances.
Professor Satz, if we could take those same 4 parameters and apply it to selling a kidney. Right now, do people have a right, if they want to sell a kidney, can they do so?
So it's illegal in almost every country of the world to sell an organ. I think Iran is currently the only country in the world in which it's legal to sell an organ. There have been times in other countries where it has been legal, and of course there's a very big black market. So even though it's illegal in many countries, it's not enforced. And in the context of the globe, when we look at the black market, we see a lot of the parameters that I mentioned in play. So many people who, I'll give you actually a striking example. I had an undergraduate student who wrote an honors thesis here at Stanford and studied people who had sold their kidney in India in a period when kidney selling was legalized for a very short period. And so he went and he found about 85 people who had sold their kidneys. And one thing he found was that a significant number of them didn't know how many kidneys they had. So that's very bad information. They didn't understand what the consequences of selling a kidney would be. In the United States, giving up an organ is relatively safe, and there are not very bad health consequences. It's possible to live with one kidney. It does have some health consequences as you age, but when you have access to clean water and live a kind of a comfortable life, you can be fine. In the context where these people were selling their kidneys in India, there were lots of health consequences which they weren't aware of. So this is all about weak information. A lot of people sold their kidney. The main reason was to get out of debt. Most people didn't get out of debt. And where body parts are available, creditors use them as collateral for loans. And so that's a third-party effect. That's even if I didn't want to sell my kidney. Now, I'm affected if I'm very poor and I'm trying to get a loan and the amount of credit is constant. Suddenly the pricing of loans has changed because other people have this collateral they can put up. And if I don't put up my collateral, I'll be less likely to be an attractive prospect for the creditor. So that, there's actually been an anthropologist who studied that. And that's a very concerning issue. And that tells you something else about markets, which is markets often have third-party effects on other people. They don't just affect the two transactors, but they affect third parties who weren't involved in the exchange at all. I'll just give you one other example that I think is really shows this is child labor. So where a society has child labor is also illegal in most countries, but it's not enforced. The state often doesn't or doesn't want to, can't or doesn't want to enforce. Often when child labor is widespread, adult wages are low because there's more supply of labor. And that means if I don't want to send my children to work, but my wages are lower because of the bigger supply and demand, I'm going to be less able to keep my child from going into work. So sometimes when you can close off a market option, you can actually enlarge the options that are open for people. That's not always the case. We have to be careful, and we have to be careful when we think about policy, and I don't draw immediate policy conclusions from anything I write. But I'm just trying to analyze what I think is a pretty widespread set of intuitions that not all markets are the same.
Final question, Debra Satz. Adam Smith, Karl Marx, are we anywhere in the same vicinity when we're talking about markets today? Are we anywhere near what they were writing about hundreds of years ago?
Some of their insights are still with us, but economics